growth. I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart of mine embraces all day through. In that small cafe, the park across the way, the children's carousel, the chestnut trees, the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way.
I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new,
I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you.
So this actually might be a surprise to some of you. I didn't actually start off my academic career in philosophy. I actually started out in political science. The first philosophy class I took was Philosophy 100, Rhetoric and Reasoning. It was mostly learning logical fallacies and learning how to do truth tables. So I didn't get much out of that. The first philosophy text I ended up reading was Plato's Symposium. It wasn't in philosophy, it was in English. It was technically liberal studies. We read the Symposium. For those of you who haven't read the Symposium, there is some detailed defenses made of Greek pederasty, which kind of threw me off. So it actually, ironically, it wasn't even like a philosophy course or reading, my first philosophy text or anything like that, which actually got me into philosophy. What it was can't see this fucking mask. The Broadview Anthology. Broadview Anthology of Social and Political Thought, from Plato to Nietzsche. This was a really, really foundational book for me. It's not your traditional textbook in the sense that they don't just have chapters on things. What they have is actual selections from particular writers. So rather than just giving you a chapter on this is what Locke thought, it'll give you a little blurb on who Locke was, when he wrote, why he was writing about what he was writing about, and then it would basically give you a selection of Locke's important writings, or a few very important writings to Locke's social and political thought. And this, I think, is still, if you're interested in this stuff, an extremely, extremely useful resource, because it gives you an extremely broad overview, a broad view of exactly what's going on in the book and in the history of political thought. But what it does is it forces you to read primary sources, and I'm a big primary sources guy. So the fact that it's so centered around being an anthology of primary sources is sort of my go-to. So it was actually this book and this class is a two-part class where we basically read half the book the first semester and half the book the next semester that really turned me on to philosophy as a whole. Obviously, political theory was my specialty, but there's a lot in this book, and there's a lot in political theory that tends to reach outside of what we might strictly think of politics, and we'll definitely get into that, maybe not so much in this video, but when we get to Plato for sure. So considering I actually have a degree in politics, you would think that YouTube politics would be kind of my go-to. I mean, that's really where my expertise started. I only became a double major later on when I discovered how interesting philosophy was to me. So it seems like being a YouTube politics guy should sort of be an obvious choice. I mean, that's what I was trained in. I'm on YouTube now. YouTube politics is a massive, massive behemoth of income generation for a lot of streamers and the like. So it should be an obvious choice that I would get into politics. YouTube politics.
Plane crashes, desert island. You wake up, but somebody else, the only other survivor, woke up before you. And they have collected all the coconuts, the only food sources on the island. They have them. They're theirs now. And they say they'll provide you coconuts so long as you suck their dick.
So there's no definition of a human right.
You really don't. People who understand and empathize with other...
It's an enormous bag of horse food. Oh boy, oh boy,
Not so fast there, pony boy.
Let him have it!
Please, no. I have a white wife and kids.
I don't give a fuck. I am a Mongoloid. In my heart, I'm a Mongoloid. That is what I am.
Wet ass P-word. Make that pullout game weak.
You know, do I love black people? I'm not sure I would say I love black people. No.
Do you hate black people?
Yelling a long tirade of how awful you think.
Next question. Next question.
To come along with the spiritual rewards of telling the truth. You shouldn't expect that.
The group does not suffer.
Go ahead and go.
I don't know what the total turnout of percentage.
Why don't you know? You know it's huge. You know
because I know
huge.
that in some states it was 70%.
She put her plastic penis dildo into my stamina training unit is the name of this product. Into my plastic vagina.
Right. And so no, you've been begging for it for a long time with everyone
Steven,
bigger than
why
yourself.
Are you so
he found
worried
he
about
can't build an audience, and so what happens is he uploads 15 times more.
So anyways, I was kind of hesitant to do a video on politics, but what I'm going to do is this series is going to be strictly focused on political theory. It's going to be focused around reading some of the important thinkers throughout the entire history of Western thought and trying to gain a little bit of a footing on what's going on today by proxy. Not by looking at it, the minutiae of what's actually happening today, but instead going back and looking through how politics has been looked at throughout history, how the philosophy of politics has evolved throughout history, and what that means for us. And to begin, we're going to be reading Thucydides. Thucydides was a very, very influential Greek thinker. He is basically considered the father of modern history. So where history in Thucydides' time would have been somebody like Herodotus, of course, a very well-known thinker in his own right. What Herodotus used to do is basically just write down whatever stories he heard. So if he was going to Egypt, for instance, he would go and ask learned Egyptians what sort of the history of Egypt was, and then he would just kind of write down the stories that he heard, and that was considered history. Not everything would be 100% accurate. In fact, Herodotus admits at many points that he doesn't believe the story that he's telling you, or that he's heard this story in several different ways, and he's just giving you his favorite account of it. He even says at one point, I believe this is in his tales about Egypt, he says something like, these stories may suit an uneducated man, but those who have... Basically, if you're educated enough, you won't believe these stories that he's telling you. But that it is his job to basically record the history as he hears it. And so that attachment to real, actual history, right, the validity of world history, isn't actually so much a concern. The concern is much more based towards telling the stories by which these cultures understood themselves, their mythology and stuff like that. Thucydides wanted to write a book that would last forever. He said something like, I'm going to paraphrase here because I can't actually read anything in this fucking mask. Something like, my history is not meant to meet the needs of an immediate public, but rather to be read forever. And since it isn't meant to be simply a story to be told, it isn't an oral history, for instance, it is primarily in writing. And it's writing which, even you might be able to tell, kind of me struggling to read it a little bit, it's even written in such a way that doesn't really flow all that much. It's written in a very dry kind of way. And this is interesting because, again, it reflects much more towards modern history, what we would think of as a very dry, fact-based, dare I say pedantic discipline. And in fact, one of the critiques that the ancients made of Thucydides was that he wasn't very narrative. He didn't really tell a good story. And it's interesting because nowadays when we think about history and historians, we don't really think about the people who tell the best story as being the best historians. It's more about the people who have the most facts, who are able to offer the most evidence, who have the widest variety of sources, stuff like that. So why Thucydides was so important in his work, and why he even wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. Well, the Peloponnesian War was between Athens and what would have been known at the time Lacedaemonia, which is Sparta in modern vernacular. And Thucydides was an Athenian, and in fact he was actually involved in the Peloponnesian War, and something happened. He supposedly didn't make it to a battle on time to defend a city, something like that, and what ended up happening was he was exiled from Athens. So where does he go when he's exiled from Athens? Well, he goes to Lacedaemonia, to Sparta. And so you have this person who literally lived on both sides of the war. He was a general who fought for the Athenians, and then he became later an exile who lived with the Spartans. So he had first-hand accounts of both sides of the war. And I say Greeks here, but I should be very careful because there really isn't any Greece. There is no great Greek king in charge of everything or anything like that, right? These are what are called city-states. So each city-state, even though it might just be simply a city, like Athens or Sparta, it is considered its own independent country. It's its own sovereign state. And so in times of war, for instance, like when the Persians invaded what the Greeks would have called the Medes, the Mede Empire, they teamed up because basically they were all culturally quite similar. They spoke the same language. They have quite a kind of civic nationalism between the city-states, which would allow the Hellenic peoples to work together and defeat great empires and yada yada yada. But in peace times, the city-states were just as likely to war with one another as they were to war with anybody else. And this is what the Peloponnesian War is going to be. It's where the two greatest city-states, the two most powerful city-states, Athens and Sparta, basically begin to mark out their empires and go to war. On one side, you have the Delian League. The Delian League was the Athenians, and the Peloponnesian League, which would have been the Spartans. I'm just going to say the Athenian Empire and the Spartan Empire because it's just a lot easier on everybody. But that's what they would have been referred to. So if you hear anywhere, terms Lacedaemonia or, the Medes or the Delian League or anything like that, just giving you a little bit of background on what those mean. But I'm going to try to keep my terminology as clear as I possibly can. So it's a bit like a proto-World War scenario where everybody kind of has these ties and bonds and alliances with one another, and then basically it ends up being half of ancient Greece versus the other half of ancient Greece. If you're curious about trying to put kind of a pin in when this was all happening, one of the Athenian citizens who was fighting out as a hoplite at this time would have been Socrates. And in fact, Socrates won a great amount of distinction in this war. He was something like a war hero for his bravery in battle. And he was quite well regarded because of that. But there is one island nation, technically kin to the Spartans, but they have resisted choosing a side so far in the Peloponnesian War, and that island is called Milos. So as I'm sure everyone's aware, the Spartans are quite well renowned for their soldiers, particularly their hoplites at this point in time were basically considered one of the strongest or most feared military forces in the world. What is less known today is that at the same time, Athens was basically just as well known for its navy. So, to the masters of the sea, this small, neutral island of Milos must have looked like a fruit ripe for the picking. Let's let Thucydides continue from here. The Melian Dialog. The next summer, Alcibiades sailed with 20 ships to Argos and seized 300 suspected Spartan sympathizers, whom the Athenians forthwith lodged in the neighboring islands of their empire. The Athenians also made an expedition against the island of Milos, with 30 ships of their own, 6 Chian and 2 Lesbian vessels, 1,600 foot soldiers, 300 archers, and 20 mounted archers from Athens, and about 1,500 hoplites from the allies and the islanders. The Melians are a colony of Sparta that would not submit to the Athenians like the other islanders, and at first remained neutral and took no part in the struggle. But afterwards, when the Athenians used violence against them and plundered their territory, they assumed an attitude of open hostility. Cleomedes, son of Lycomedes, and Tisias, son of Tisimachus, the generals encamping in the Melian territory with the Athenian forces, before doing any harm to their land, sent envoys to negotiate. The Melians did not bring these envoys before the people, but bade them state the object of their mission to the magistrates and the few. Then the Athenian envoys spoke as follows. Athenians. Since the negotiations are not to go on before the people, in order that we may not be able to speak straight on without interruption, and deceive the ears of the multitude by seductive arguments which would pass without refutation, for we know this is the meaning of our being brought before the few, what if you who sit here were to pursue a method more cautious still? Make no set speech yourselves, but interrupt us at whatever you do not like, and settle that before going any further. And first tell us if this proposition of ours suits you. The Melian commissioners answered, Melians, to the fairness of calmly instructing each other as you propose, there is nothing to object, but your military preparations are too far advanced to be consistent with what you say, as we see you are come to be judges in your own cause. All we can reasonably expect from this negotiation is war, if we prove to have right on our side and refuse to submit, or, in the contrary case, slavery. The Melians are obviously on guard. They don't want to just bring them down to their people and let them say whatever they want to say. And they basically say right off the bat, look, we know what game is being played here. You don't bring an entire military across the ocean just to negotiate some peace terms. We know there are two outcomes here. Either we reject your offer of peace and we go to war, or we accept your offer of peace and we are subjugated and we lose our freedom. Athenians. If you have met us to reason about your suspicions about the future, or for anything else other than to consult for the sake of the safety of your state about the facts that you see before you, we will cease talking. Otherwise, we will go on. Melians, it is natural and excusable for men in our position to think and argue in more ways than one. However, the question in this conference is, as you say, the safety of our country, and the discussion, if you please, can proceed in the way which you propose. Athenians, for ourselves, we shall not trouble you with our specious pretenses, either of how we have a right to our empire because we overthrew the Mede, or are now attacking you because of wrong that you have done us, and make a long speech which would not be believed. And in return, we hope that you, instead of thinking to influence us by saying that you did not join the Spartans, although they're colonists, or that you have done us no wrong, will aim at what is feasible, holding in view what we both really do think. Since you know as well as we do that the way the world works is that justice is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak accept what they must. So here is perhaps the most famous and probably the most explored line from the dialogue. The way the world works is that justice is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak do what they must. So the obvious question here is, are they right? Are the Athenians right? And personally, I think this actually isn't the easiest question to answer, and we will explore why it might not be as clear-cut as you might think on first blush. For now, however, keep the central problem posed by this negotiation. The Melians think they have a right to their land, to their people, to their freedom, which has stood for hundreds of years, while the Athenians insist that their relative military weakness to Athens means that they simply do not get to appeal to abstract concepts like right and justice, because these are concepts which only come into existence between parties of equal strength. If you are too weak to resist the force of the party opposed to you, you cannot object to the whims of that party. You are weak, and you do what you must. Melians. As we think, at any rate, it is expedient, we speak as we are obliged, since you enjoin us to let right alone and talk only of interest, that you should not destroy a principle that is our common protection, namely, that one in danger is allowed to invoke what is fair and right, and even to profit by arguments not strictly valid, if they can be persuasive. And you have as much interest in this as anyone, as your fall would be a signal for the heaviest vengeance and an example for the world to meditate upon. Athenians. The end of our empire, if it should, does not frighten us. A rival empire like Sparta, even if Sparta was our real antagonist, is not so terrible to the vanquished as an attack by our own subjects overpowering their rulers. This, however, is a risk we are content to take. We will now proceed to show you that we have come here in the interest of our empire, and that we shall say what we are going to say for the preservation of your country, as we would desire to exercise that empire over you without trouble, and see you preserved for the good of us both. Melians. And how, pray, could it turn out as good for us to serve as for you to rule? Athenians. Because you would have the advantage of submitting before suffering the worst, and we should gain by not destroying you. So the Melians retort that since they are the weaker party, they have no real other choice but to make arguments like this. The weaker party is going to make any argument, nonsensical or not, to gain an advantage where they can. But the Athenians, again not engaging them on this idea of rights, now claim that they are trying to help the Melians, as they are actually trying to give them an easy out. They're saying, look, we could destroy you, we could wipe your people off the face of the earth, but that's a lot of good stuff being destroyed. There's a lot of good people we could have in our empire that we're wasting. Good laborers killed rather than enslaved. Property being destroyed, which we can enjoy. And on your end, well, you're all dead. So, obviously the better option for both parties, because we're such a nice, we're such a kind and generous people, is to take our good offer and surrender. Melians. So you would not consent to our being neutral, friends instead of enemies, but allies of neither side? Athenians. No, for your hostility cannot hurt us that much. Your friendship will be assigned to our subjects of our weakness, and your enmity of our power. Melians. Is that your subjects' idea of equity, that you would put those who have nothing to do with you in the same category as people who are most of them in your own colonists, or conquered rebels? Athenians. As far as right goes, they think there is no difference between them, and that if they maintain in their independence it is because they are strong, and that if we do not molest them it is because we are afraid, so that besides expanding our empire we should gain in security by your subjugation. The fact you are islanders and weaker than others, rendering it all the more important that you should not succeed in thwarting the masters of the sea. Melians. But do you consider that there is no security in the policy which we indicate? For here again, if you debar us from talking about justice, and invite us to obey your interest, we must explain ours, and try to persuade you, if the two happen to coincide. How can you avoid making enemies of all existing neutrals who shall look over our case, and conclude from it that one day or another you will attack them? And what does this do but make greater the enemies you have already, and force others to become enemies who otherwise would have never thought of it? Athenians, why, the fact is that the mainlanders generally give us little alarm. The liberty which they enjoy will long prevent their taking precautions against us. It is rather islanders like yourself, outside our empire, and subjects smarting under the yoke, who would be most likely to take a rash step and lead themselves, and us, into obvious danger. Melians. Well then, if you risk so much to retain your empire, and your subjects risk so much to get rid of it, it would surely be a great weakness and cowardice to those who are still not free, to not try everything that can be tried before submitting to your yoke. Athenians. Not if you are well advised, for the contest is not an equal one, with honor as the prize and shame as the penalty. Rather, it is a question of self-preservation, and of not resisting those who are far stronger than you. Melians. But we know that the fortune of war is sometimes more impartial than the disproportion of numbers might lead one to suppose. To submit is to give ourselves over to despair, while action still preserves for us a hope that we may stand erect. Athenians. Hope, danger's comforter, may be indulged in by those who have abundant resources, if not without loss, at all events without ruin. But its nature is to be extravagant, and those who go so far as to stake everything on a venture see it in its true colors only when they are ruined. But when that discovery would have enabled them to guard against it, they never lack hope. Let not this be the case with you, who are weak and whose fate hangs on a single turn of the scale. Nor be like the vulgar who, abandoning such security as human means may still afford, when visible hopes fail them in extremity, turn to the invisible, to prophecies and oracles, and other such inventions that delude men with hopes and lead them to their destruction. So this is another quite important theme of the work, I think. Political realism, I guess you could call it. If there is a concrete chance for survival with a loss and a hypothetical chance for survival with a benefit, you should always take the loss and go for the concrete chance. When it comes to matters of life and death, the last thing you should do is start taking chances. And in war, questions of life and death are abound. This is where political theory, where history, finds its roots in the Western world. Politics has, from the very beginning, been intimately related with the existential risks relating to war and conquest. Melians. You may be sure that we are as well aware as you of the difficulty of contending against your power and fortune, unless the terms be equal. But we trust that the gods may grant us fortune as good as yours, since we are just men fighting against injustice. And what we lack in power will be made up by the alliance of the Spartans, who are bound, if only in order to avoid shame, to come to the aid of their kindred. Our confidence, therefore, after all, is not so utterly irrational. Athenians. When you speak of the favor of the gods, we may as fairly hope for that as yourselves, neither our pretensions nor our conduct being in any way contrary to what men believe of the gods or practice among themselves. Of the gods we believe, and of men we know, that by a necessary law of the nature they rule wherever they can. And it is not as if we were the first to make this law, or to act upon it when made. We found it existing before us, and we shall leave it to exist forever after us. All we do is make use of it, knowing that you and everybody else, having the same power as we have, would do the same. Thus, as far as the gods are concerned, we have no fear and no reason to fear that we shall be at a disadvantage. But when we come to your notion about the Spartans, which leads you to believe that shame will make them help you, here we bless your simplicity, but we do not envy your folly. The Spartans, when their own interests or their country's laws are in question, are the worthiest men alive. Of their conduct towards others, much might be said, but no clearer idea of it could be given than by briefly stating that of all the men we know,
They are the most conspicuous in considering what they find agreeable is honorable, and what they find expedient is just. Such a way of thinking does not promise much for the safety which you now unquestionably count upon.
So they're throwing some shade at the Spartans here. Sure, the Spartans are known for always doing the honorable thing, but they also happen to always assert that the honorable thing just happens to be the thing that's in their best interest. Should the battle not seem in their best interest, it won't be long before the battle will lose that honorific status that you're counting on in order to kind of coerce them to uphold their bonds. So basically, they're saying, well, yes, the Spartans are, especially in their own tradition, known for this honor, for being duty-bound and stuff like that. That honor, that duty, always tends to be colored by their interests, just like the Athenians' actions are colored by their interests. Melians. But it is for this very reason that we now trust to the respect for expediency to prevent them from betraying the Melians, their colonists, and thereby losing the confidence of their friends in Greece and helping their enemies. Athenians. Then you do not adopt the view that expediency goes with security, while justice and honor cannot be followed without danger, and that the Spartans generally court danger as little as possible. Melians. But we believe that they would be more likely to face even danger for our sake, and with more confidence than others, as our nearness to the Peloponnesus makes it easier for them to act, and our common blood ensures our fidelity. Athenians. Yes, but what prospective allies trust is not the goodwill of those who ask his aid, but a decided superiority of power for action. And the Spartans look to this even more than others. At least such is their distrust of the home resources, that it is only with the aid of numerous allies that they attack a neighbor. Now, is it likely, while we are the masters of the sea, that they will cross to an island? Melians. But they would have others to send. The Cretan Sea is a wide one, and it is more difficult for those who command it to intercept others than for those who wish to elude them to do so safely. And should the Spartans miscarry in this, they would turn against your land, and upon those left of your allies whom Brasidas did not reach. And instead of places which are not yours, you will have to fight for your own country and your own confederacy. Athenians. Some diversion of the kind you speak of you may one day experience, only to learn, as others have done, that the Athenians never once withdrew from a siege for fear of others. But we are struck by the fact that, after saying that you would consult for the safety of your country, in all this discussion you have mentioned nothing which a man might trust in, and think he might be saved by. Your strongest arguments depend on hope and the future, and your actual resources are too scanty compared with those arrayed against you, for you to come out victorious. You will therefore show great blindness of judgment if, after allowing us to retire from this meeting, you have not found some counsel more prudent than this. You will surely not be influenced by the idea of disgrace which proves so fatal to mankind when they face dangers that are disgraceful, and at the same time too plain to be mistaken. In too many cases, the very men who have their eyes perfectly open to what they are rushing into let the thing called disgrace, by the mere influence of a seductive name, lead them on to a point at which they become so enslaved by the phrase as in fact to fall wilfully into hopeless disaster, and incur disgrace which is more disgraceful when accompanied by error than when it comes as the result of misfortune. This, if you are well advised, you will guard against, and you will not think it dishonorable to submit to the greatest city in Greece, when it makes you the reasonable offer of becoming a tribute-paying ally, without ceasing to enjoy the country that belongs to you, nor when you have the choice given you between war and security, will you be so blind as to choose the worse. And it is certain that those who do not yield to their equals, who keep terms with their superiors, and are reasonable towards their inferiors, on the whole succeed the best. Think over the matter, therefore, after our withdrawal, and reflect once and again that it is for your country that you are consulting, that you have only one country, and that upon this one deliberation depends its prosperity or its ruin.
The Athenians now withdrew themselves from the conference, and the Melians, left to themselves, came to a decision much the same as they had maintained in the discussion, and answered, "Our resolution, Athenians, is the same as it was at first. We will not in a moment deprive of freedom a city that has been inhabited these 700 years. But we will put trust in the fortune by which the gods have preserved it up until now, and in the help of men, that is, of the Spartans. And so we will try and save ourselves. Meanwhile, we will invite you to allow us to be friends to you, and foes to neither party, and to retire from our country after making such a treaty as shall seem fit to us both." Such was the answer of the Melians. The Athenians, now departing from the conference, said, "Well, you alone, as it seems to us, judging from these resolutions, regard what is future as more certain than what is before your eyes, and what is out of sight, in your eagerness, as already coming to pass. And as you have staked your fortune and your hopes most on the Spartans, and trusted most in them, so you will be the most completely deceived." The Athenian envoys now returned to the army, and as the Melians showed no signs of yielding, the generals at once commenced hostilities and built a wall around the city of Milos, dividing the work among the different states. Subsequently, the Athenians returned home with most of their army, leaving behind them a certain number of their own citizens and of the allies to keep guard by land and sea. The force thus left stayed on and besieged the place. About the same time, the Argives invaded the territory of Phlegia and lost 80 men cut off in an ambush by the Phlegian and Argive exiles. Meanwhile, the Athenians at Pylos took so much plunder from the Spartans that the latter, although they still refrained from breaking off the treaty and going to war with Athens, yet proclaimed that any of their people that chose might plunder the Athenians. The Corinthians also commenced hostilities with the Athenians for private quarrels of their own, but the rest of the Peloponnesians stayed quiet. Meanwhile, the Melians attacked by night and captured part of the Athenian lines near the market, and killed some of the men, and brought in corn and all else they could find useful to them, and so returned and kept quiet while the Athenians took measures to keep better guarded in the future. Summer was now over. The next winter the Spartans intended to invade the Argive territory, but arriving at the frontier found the sacrifices for the crossing unfavorable, and went back again. This attempt of theirs made the Argives suspicious of certain of their fellow citizens, some of whom they arrested. Others, however, escaped them. About the same time the Melians again took another part of the Athenian lines, which were only a few of the garrison. Reinforcements afterwards arriving from Athens in consequence, under the command of Philocrates, son of Demeas, and the siege was now pressed vigorously, as there was some treachery taking place inside. The Melians surrendered unconditionally to the Athenians, who put to death all grown men whom they took, and sold the women and children for slaves, and subsequently sent out 500 colonists, and settled the place themselves.
So if you are new to the Melian dialogue, I hope this affected you just as much as it affected me when I first read it. Milos was a country which had stood for 700 years. And it fell due to one political negotiation. All the men killed, all the women and children sold into slavery. 700 years. Canada, I live in Canada. I think Canada has been around for something like 150 years. So we're talking like 5 times longer than the history of Canada, than my country. Wiped off the face of the earth. One political negotiation. And so when we think about political realism, this is what really is the crux of the whole issue. It isn't necessarily that might makes right is the be-all and end-all to morality. It's that the stakes of politics are life and death. This is the ultimate political wedge, you could think of it as. The wedge between will my country survive and will my country not survive? So let's look a little bit more at Athens, why don't we? Athens is an interesting one because people tend to have a pretty... they have a meme in their head of what Athens is, right? Athens is where the philosophers lived. Athens is where they practiced democracy. Athens is where you were free to say what you want and think what you want. But it's more complicated than that. So to begin with, Athens' democracy, it's not a representative democracy. It's not a democracy like we have in the West today. What Athens was a direct democracy. So everybody would gather at, or everybody, I should say citizens, and citizens here specifically means land-owning males. So it's a thinner definition of citizen than we're used to working with. But the citizens would go down to the what they call the Nix. It starts with a P. P silent, I believe. Nix. You go to the Nix. You have a opportunity to speak your mind. So if you feel like you have something to say, you can get up in front of the assembly and speak your mind. After everybody has said their piece, everybody votes on whatever they were talking about, and whatever the vote ends up being is what the city will undertake. Interestingly, if you were to, for instance, say you were to vote to go to war, many of the people, this would have been the case for many of the people in the Peloponnesian War. So say you voted to go take Milos. You say, yeah, I think Milos is unguarded. I do think we have the ability to take it, yada, yada, yada. So you vote yes. You were expected as an Athenian citizen who voted yes to that war to go to your house, get your shield, get your spear, get your helmet, and get on the boat when it leaves to go fight on Milos. I often kind of consider sort of how many of our representatives would vote to go to war if they actually had to go down there and fight on the front lines. But in this case, again, Athens is an empire. It's a warmongering country. So even this direct democracy of you have to put your own life on the line still wasn't enough to tamper their bloodthirst, the power grab, whatever you want to call it. Another interesting element of Athens at the time was that political office was filled by lot. So rather than being elected or something like that, the ministers, the people in charge of various things in the city would be chosen by lottery. So one day, you at the assembly, they could draw the lots and say, oh, it turns out you're Minister of Finance, whatever they would have called that job at the time. And you, regardless of what you understood about finance, regardless of what your experience in the field is, whatever, you were expected to be the Minister of Finance. That was your job. You were to take it on until the next go. It wasn't considered good manners or anything to turn it down. If you were, say, you didn't feel up to it or you didn't think that you were the most qualified, whatever, you were not expected to turn it down. And the people who refused to, for instance, work jobs, work offices assigned by lot, people who refused to go down to the Nix and argue and vote, they were known as the idiota. So what the idiota were, technically it translates from Greek as something like a private person. So the idiota were the class of private people, the people who didn't participate in the polis. Polis is Greek for city. It's actually where we get the word politics. So the people who refused to participate in the polis were the idiota. We still refer to this kind of, what would you call it, secondary class of citizenry in Athens. Every time we call someone an idiot, that's literally where the term came from, the idiota. So there's an interesting kind of a throwback there every time you call your friend an idiot. Anyway, comparing and contrasting sort of representative democracy and the Athenian democracy, the direct democracy that they practiced in Athens, it's very interesting. There's plenty of good stuff you can draw out of that, plenty of different contrasts and similarities and whatnot. I could take up the whole video doing that, but it might be a little bit more interesting to reflect on why Athens chose to take over Milos. Some people might think that because the direct democracy is so so close to, what would we say? It's almost, it's closer to the true expression of the people. At least that's the way we would feel, right? That it's not these elected representatives working out their mandates, choosing what the direction of the country is. It's the people themselves talking with one another and expressing their true feelings, and thus it should lead to something more maybe harmonious or maybe more peaceful. But the truth is, it's just not the case. And honestly, I don't think it's too hard to think about why. I mean, when people were going up and giving their speeches, sure, I'm sure there were people who would give up and give their speeches about the rights of people and the yada yada yada, morality. But ultimately, there was going to be a lot of people up there who were arguing for political reasons, because they want the Athenian Empire to be expanded, because they want the power and influence that the Athenian Empire has won, that they want the goods and the riches, that they want to be more wealthy, and they know there's a lot of money to be plundered. I mean, all these things are just as real of a force of affecting people's opinions as they are today. And in fact, one of the groups of people that people like Plato were quite critical of in ancient Greece were the sophists. And sophist, obviously where we get the word sophistry. So where the sophists would, it's hard to actually describe what the sophists did, because there really isn't a job like it today. It's something like a teacher, in a way, in that they taught rhetoric. So the wealthy, they would pay either for themselves or perhaps their children to be tutored by these sophists in order to better argue their points in something like the Knicks. So I think Plato says something like that they make the weaker argument the stronger. I think that's the idea. There was another Plato quote, actually. Rhetoric is the artificer of persuasion, having this and no other business, and this is her crown. And end. So people like Plato were quite critical of the sophists, specifically because of this, because they focused on rhetoric and because they didn't really focus on trying to teach people the truth so much as teaching people how to make their own ideas seem like the truth. And I think this is one of the biggest issues with direct democracy. Direct democracy is still sometimes held up as some political ideal that we need to strive towards. But really, people don't know everything. People aren't just by their own nature some authentic being in touch with reality and truth. And in fact, it's quite easy to convince people that the weaker argument is the stronger if you simply have, some good rhetorical flourishes. This also might help us understand why, for instance, Athens put Socrates to death. Now, some people get confused about this. They look, it's a direct democracy. The people should clearly understand that Socrates is a benefit to the society, right? But Socrates was described, I believe actually by himself, as something like a gadfly, somebody constantly pestering the Athenians. And obviously, they charged him technically with, was it persuading the youth, corrupting the youth, and impiety, I believe, were his two charges. But Socrates, he if you read the Apology, Socrates doesn't really spend that much time trying to debunk the idea that he's impious or that he corrupts the youth. He does bring it up and he does kind of play around with the ideas a little bit. But by and large, the Apology is it's almost like Socrates knows that this is a sham. And in fact, Socrates, they ask him at some point, what do you think should be done now that you're being put to, now that you're guilty of impiety and corrupting the youth? And what he says is that he should get a free lunch at the fancy socialite place to eat, basically, for the rest of his life. That basically they just give him free food forever, because he has something about how the last thing he would want is social recognition and recognizability. So if you really want to harm me, give me free lunches at this really nice socialite kind of place, and then I'll really suffer. They probably took that as a slight as well, which again might have led to the people getting angry and maybe making a decision that was weaker than the one of keeping them around. So now that we've explored a little bit about maybe why Athens would have done something like this, let's ask the hard question. Stroke my tentacles for a second. Was Athens right? Now, this is actually something of a difficult question. It may be simple enough to you, as somebody who already has political opinions and whatnot, but when we look at it from this more abstracted position of political realism, were the Athenians right? And I don't think this is actually as easy of a question as you all might with your own political opinions. So the question really becomes, what is justice? I think that's the ultimate sort of crux of division between the Athenians and the Melians in this dialogue. The Athenians have a particular conception of justice, which is, I mean, it's a workable definition. Justice is something which exists between equals. And if two countries aren't equal, there isn't any conception of justice between what one country does to the other, what the stronger does to the weaker. Justice only comes about when two powers of similar power come together, right? Two powers of similar force. And it's this sort of balance of power which supports justice. But without a balance of power, the concept of justice simply doesn't exist. The strong do what they can, and the weak do what they must. So this is what, as we have already kind of touched upon, is typically known as political realism. One of the interesting things about, I think, the Melian dialogue in terms of political realism is how the Athenians were right. I should make a clear distinction here. They were right materially. They were right in terms of their predictions. They said that the Melians either surrendered or they would be wiped off the face of the earth. That ended up being true. They said that the Spartans weren't actually going to come and help them because the Spartans aren't actually as honorable as you might think. That ended up being true. And in fact, they even said something like the Spartans are going to, whichever side they end up picking is the one that they will decide is the most honorable. And so what ended up being the thing which discouraged the Spartans from coming to help? The message from the gods. It was divination. So of course it's more honorable to be pious to the gods than it is to go help the Melians. And we could even think about it in a more cynical way of, maybe the Spartans, again, there's no real way to know this, maybe the Spartans didn't even get a divination. Maybe they knew right from the beginning that they weren't going to put their army at risk in the middle of the Aegean Sea to be destroyed by the Athenian navy. Maybe they knew right off the bat that the Melians weren't worth protecting. And again, we don't have any way to know whether that's really true or not. All we have is the account of the divination. But it's interesting that the Athenians, again, were right. The Athenians predicted exactly what was going to happen. They knew that the Spartans would see it more in their interest, right? More in lines with political realism, in their state interests, that it wasn't worth going and protecting Milos. And so they knew in advance what the honorable decision, quote unquote honorable decision, would be among the Spartans. And again, this is all speculation because there isn't any real way to know whether the Spartans were this cynical, whether they actually were operating on this level of political realism, but I do find it striking that the Athenians were able to understand the political situation in such an acute way, in a much more acute way than the Melians. So I guess the question really comes down to it is, when you're faced with these sorts of political realities, is existence more important than principles, than again, abstract things like justice, right? What if, let's just imagine that the story went a different way. Imagine the Melians surrendered to the Athenians, and they were able to, not be genocided off the face of the earth. Would anything be any different? Seriously, would anything historically be any different? I don't think so. I think that ultimately the outcome today that would happen for the Melian people, right, ultimately would be better if they subjected themselves to this kind of thing. Because 2,000 years later, who cares who was and wasn't part of the Athenian Empire? Who cares whether the Spartans supported you, your independence 2,000 years ago, right? It just seems so far removed from anything meaningful today that it's hard to look back on that and say, oh yes, standing up for their rights, standing up for whatever was the right decision for the Melians to make, because there are no Melians. Again, that people was wiped off the face of the earth. I think it's also useful to, at this point, kind of flip the question around then. Were the Melians right in what they did? Right? At first we asked, were the Athenians right to invade Milos? And the Athenians will basically say that, well, that since Milos is an equal power, that question of whether it's right or not simply doesn't apply. And what the Melians are said basically is that there is right and wrong, and that we as pious people must trust in the gods and appeal that the good will happen and that things will work out the way they should. 700 years of history just wiped off the face of the earth for that decision. 700 years. Again, maybe that isn't as striking as it is to you as it is to me, but I mean, once you start studying world history, you realize that for a people to be around 700 years means something. It means that they, were extremely politically effective. Again, Canada, the United States, these countries aren't anywhere close to as old as Milos was. So simply having a history, simply having a successful political history doesn't mean anything in the face of these existential threats. And the scariest thing about it for me was that when you're reading the dialogue, the Melian genocide doesn't even get a whole sentence. It's like a tacked on clause in a sentence about winning the siege. Here's the exact sentence. Reinforcements afterwards arriving from Athens in consequence under the command of Philocrates, son of Demeus, the siege now pressed vigorously, and some treachery taking place inside, the Melians surrendered at discretion to the Athenians, who put to death all the grown men whom they took and sold the women and children for slaves, and subsequently sent out 500 colonists and inhabited the place themselves. That's 19 words in English. It might even be fewer in ancient Greek. And this has this sort of, that's all history has to say about you quality that is just incredibly chilling to me. Again, is this worth it? Was it worth it for the Melians to be wiped off the face of the earth? For the Melians, because again, it was, as much as it was the Athenians who caused it, the Melians had the choice to make, and they chose to fight, and that choice wiped them off the face of the earth. And maybe it's because we live in a liberal world, but I mean, there's something that I feel is noble about standing up for freedom and resisting imperial domination, which seems ultimately to resonate even now. But political realism always seems to have this trump card, whereby regardless of what your feelings are about what's right and what's justice and whatever, it's going to be the political realities which determine the outcome. No matter how right your politics are, no matter how pure your convictions are, if your project ends up with the destruction of everything that you stood for, what was the project worth in the first place? And yet, the dialogue lives on. No matter how many times political realism may have operated and crushed a movement with right on their side, no matter how many times justice is deprived from the weak, the dialogue lives on. And if the story went another way and the Melians didn't resist, I don't think the dialogue would have meant much to anybody. It lives because no matter the political realities that seem to rule us, there is something more we like to appeal to. There's something we seem to aim for in life, regardless of even the realities of that life. Some aspiration, some virtue, perhaps, as the sophists would have even called it, arete. And this idea of something we aim at, arete, I actually believe it refers to archery in Greek. To arete is to hit the mark, basically. And what this idea of some extra political reality we are going to come into in our next thinker in the political series we have going here, and that's going to be Plato. So I hope you all join me when the next video in the series comes out, and we can separate ourselves from the warmongering Athenians and pick up on their more enlightened philosophical takes on politics. Thank you all very much, and I'll see you all then.